So welcome everyone to our EMPA Food for Thought speaker series. As always, we're honored to have you join us for our weekly sessions. If you have any questions, please keep them to the end, or if Christine and Greg want you to join during the session, they'll let you know. We're honored to have Christine Carlson and Greg Wolf, who will be discussing creating a new sector for public, private, and civic partnership. I will hand it off to Bill for the intro, and our recordings will be up on the website in the next week or so. So thank you everyone again for joining us.
Well, thank you, Jeremy and Valerie, as always, for keeping this series alive. As many of you know, we started organizing this at the beginning of the pandemic, and we're now entering our third year. Please go to the website if you haven't recently. We've got quite an impressive series of presenters and presentations, and there's knowledge up there that I think you find valuable no matter what you do. Let me echo Jeremy's thanks to all of you for staying part of this and being involved. And we're very lucky today to have two people who are very much in the spirit of our community, of working very hard from the ground up to make the world a better place. And in particular, for me, this is an interesting talk because it's very much in the spirit of what I've been working on a great deal in recent years, which is cross-sector partnerships as ways of accomplishing things that might not be possible otherwise. And Chris and Greg are partners in this endeavor. They both work currently in the what I would call the third sector or the social sector, but they both have roots in government and a whole range of positions. Chris currently is the executive director of Policy Consensus. It's a national nonprofit of elected leaders that focus on collaboration at the state level in particular. And she's been involved in university relations as well with Portland State and collaborations between universities and government, like we do a lot. And she also was in government in Ohio and worked in the foundation world as well, and was an elected official. So she really fits the SEPA profile, as does Greg, who's got more than 30 years of experience in government and collaboration. I believe he's currently the director of the Oregon Community Partnership. He's founded cross-sector partnerships at the county level. He's worked in land conservation. He worked for Portland State. I'm sure they'll go into great detail of their experiences and what they've learned. They came to my attention because they were key players in a very exciting initiative that was able to work public sector, private sector, third sector to create affordable housing for people who would have otherwise been homeless. And it very much is in the spirit of what I've been working and writing about in a wholly different sphere, that is big urban areas like New York City, to take, in their case, they worked with hotels. In our case, it'd be both hotels and office buildings here in New York, which are largely empty these days. And even post-COVID, soon, hope post-COVID, people will come back, but nowhere near the number of vacant floors in buildings that are very convertible into housing. And I think that's, there's an old saying, never waste a good crisis. And we've been in a funny way, a very big good in the sense of being large and an impactful crisis for several years, but it's, in my view, created a whole change in the way people think about work and the workplace. and that's created opportunities. So enough of me. As always, the rules are Chris and Greg will be in charge in a moment, and so they'll run the session. Raise your hand, either virtually or actually. And I think Chris indicated she's going to encourage you to jump in. Just turn your mic on. So thank you again, both of you, for coming. And Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. We're going to just say a word more about our own background and how it relates to what we're doing. For me, it's really quite something to reflect back. 40 years ago, I worked at the Kettering Foundation on something called the Negotiated Investment Strategy, which was essentially an effort to bring, it was in the urban policy program, and the intent was to get different levels of government sitting down at the same table, sometimes with the private sector, to essentially resolve issues and develop plans for addressing urban issues. And out of that experience, we came up with, I mean, we did a variety of these kinds of things in cities, in St. Paul, in Gary, Indiana, in Columbus, Ohio, and then moved into Connecticut and worked on a process for allocating the social services block grant when that concept first came out, and worked with the Cherokee tribe in Oklahoma around their plans and policies and how they were impacted by state and federal government. So it feels like I'm coming full circle. And after 10 years of working in that process, we came to the conclusion that, you know, applying or using kind of mediated, negotiated approaches to dealing with tough issues was a useful thing in situations where there were a lot of participants. The authority for committing resources is dispersed. And there are, you know, it's a complex process and extensive coordination is needed. And so here we are, almost 40 years later, essentially saying, I think the same thing. That, and so after I did that, I worked primarily in the area of introducing ways to use mediation and negotiation and collaborative problem solving to address public issues. So that's kind of how my background led me to where I am today. Greg?
And I've worked for Oregon State and local government and at a university for over 35 years. And in that time, I was deputy director of the Department of Land Conservation and Development. In Oregon, we have a statewide land use program that is fairly unique in the country. It requires all cities and counties to develop comprehensive land use plans. And so I got a lot of experience from that experience. Wasn't always somewhat controversial at the time, but over time really became very solid program. And I worked for several counties doing planning coordination, but between state and local government. I also worked for the Association of Oregon Counties, helping them develop and run a county solutions program that put county commissioners in the role of convener on problem solving efforts around the state. And then I worked for 12 years for Oregon's governor in various policy advisor jobs, and also as his director of something called the Regional Solutions Program, which brought together the public, private, and civic sectors to address regional priorities in the state. And then I worked with Chris and directed the National Policy Consensus Center at Portland State University, which was an applied research and development center in collaborative governance. So back to you, Chris.
Okay. Well, I want to say that we're especially pleased to be here because we had the opportunity to read the book that Bill and Howard Buffett put together, Social Value Investing, which is really about making the case for why sector partnerships are the way to address today's complex issues. And it certainly lays out a framework and principles that we have also found are critical to doing these kinds of processes successfully. So our focus is on making the case why, in order to use this mechanism for addressing tough issues, there needs to be supportive infrastructure. The leaders need the kind of expertise and resources that can deliver on the promise of cross-sector partnerships if they're to be achieved. And for some reason, and I maybe some of you can help illuminate this, when it comes to finding support for this kind of assistance, it often doesn't get, the concept of having a supporting system doesn't get a lot of traction. And so one of the things we're trying to figure out is how to give it some traction here. And that's one of the things we'll be addressing as we go along. You know, I think that one of the things that this is going to go a little afield for a minute, just to explain why we think, why our experience has taught us these kinds of partnerships are important, but that they don't come together naturally. One of the terms that's grown in use in the public administration field of the last 20 years is collaborative governance. And the idea is that in order to address tough issues, the government alone isn't able to do that. That government certainly has tremendous resources to address public problems, but it needs the involvement of other sectors. Existing government structures and cultures make government resistant to change. I read a book a long time ago by Jane Jacobs, and she called government the guardian class. And I have found in my own experience that that's kind of the culture of government. It's not that it assumes that role, it adheres to tradition and precedent. It tends to act slowly to ensure that it is accountable to the public. And some of these problems require more innovative and more rapid response. The private sector values efficiency and inventiveness. And we've certainly seen in COVID and other emergency situations where government turns to the private sector because they have the capacity to move more quickly and to innovate. The reason we think the civic sector needs to be involved is that they are the presence that advocates for equitable outcomes in service to the whole community. And so by putting those actors together, we're more likely to get outcomes that serve the interest of the whole community. The other reason that we would make the argument that that these kinds of partnerships are important to address the tough kinds of issues like housing, real delivery of health care or mental health care in this country, and other issues of that sort, is that political cycles make it hard to sustain effort. They need long-term leadership and commitment to achieve the desired outcome. And we've all seen that when public leaders change, the continuing commitment of government may wane to certain policies that they have advocated and fought for and established mechanisms for. So to ensure that there can be more continuity in addressing some of these issues, continuity and support. We think that earning the commitment of the civic and private sector leaders along with the public leaders is an important thing. The literature shows that there are lots of cross-sector partnerships happening at the international scene, but in our search for examples, we find many fewer in the United States. And so that's one of the things that we are interested in trying to change, at least here in Oregon. There's lots of lip service and support for the idea, but primarily the case examples we see here come in the area of transportation and infrastructure development, and so not so much in the areas of social service or social and environmental issues. Having worked in states across the country, different states have different cultures and ways of doing business. And I've spent years in Ohio when I was the director. I'm no longer the director of Policy Consensus Initiative. I worked in states across the country. And one of the things I've found about Oregon and moving here is it's a state with a history and reputation of working more collaboratively. And yet we haven't seen many cross-sector partnerships to date. Each has been kind of a one-off. And so the thing we're trying to do is establish the kind of infrastructure that will provide leaders with the expertise and support they need to essentially work across sectors. Even when there is alignment in interests across sectors for addressing an issue such as housing, each sector has different modes of operating, different timelines, different incentives and constraints that can serve as barriers to sitting down and making progress on an issue. So to that end, we have formed the Oregon I sector, and Greg is going to describe what it is and how it works.
Thanks, Chris. And that's a pretty good lead into what I want to talk about. We really do believe that in Oregon, we need a new sector that can support elected officials, business, and civic leaders and help them bring partnerships together and get them to a scale that we can really start to move the dial on some of our environmental, economic, and social problems. And let me give you a little background on how we came to this idea of a new sector. I've worked alongside agencies at all levels of government. And in my experience, innovation such as cross-sector work does not come out of government agencies. For the most part, they operate out of a set of responsibilities and managing problems under laws established by their governing bodies. And they really are not designed for innovation. My career has been mostly related to supporting elected leaders using collaboration, coordination, and consensus building approaches. One of the things that I've learned is that elected leaders, have something of a secret power, and that is the power to convene stakeholders in communities. And in my experience, it really does take elected leaders to get people together to solve problems. They can get people to the problem-solving effort. They can keep them there and keep them focused on a problem or challenge in a way that is unique. And it's something that we call their convening authority. But when it comes to public-private civic partnerships, we really need to use that convening authority that elected leaders have. But that's really not sufficient. To succeed in these partnerships, the three sectors need to be co-equals to develop and implement solutions. And we believe that leaders from the public, private, and civic sector need to co-convene this kind of cross-sector work because they're creating action and taking action together. As Chris said, government alone cannot solve many of the problems we face. And the power of elected leaders and civic leaders and private leaders working in tandem is a very, very strong thing. And that, along with the various resources that they bring to problem solving, is a strong combination. And we believe that they need to be co-owners of the partnerships and the sector and a new sector itself. So to play this joint convening and implementing role, we believe that there needs to be some basic supports that a new sector can provide. We believe that leaders really do need assistance establishing strategic alignments and connections. There's a lot of staff work involved in that and supporting the leaders in that way. And they also need help with initiating and brokering these partnerships. Two, leaders need a set of principles to guide their cross-sector work. And in Bill's book, he outlines some of these principles. But we have found that joint convening, co-ownership, and joint decision-making are very important. Transparency and accountability are very important. Protocols for information sharing, communication, and decision-making should be established. And there needs to be a shared commitment to effective and equitable solutions and outcomes that meet community needs. And then third, leaders need a capacity to support the partnerships as they initiate them, including process management support, access to needed information, and assistance in leveraging resource. And once a partnership agrees on plans, they need resources for implementation. And so that capacity for all of those things, we believe, is one of the critical needs that we're trying to address. And then fourth, we believe there is a role for advocacy in helping champion and build institutional support for working across sectors. It takes advocacy to remove barriers in existing government systems, often to achieve an innovative solution. It also requires advocacy with philanthropy and the private sector to think about how they could better deploy their resources in order to effectively leverage them. And in general, leaders who wish to work through partnerships on an ongoing basis need advocates for securing resources for this kind of work. It is not something you find in a typical government budget or in, for that matter, in a lot of philanthropic programmatic approaches. So let me give you a little bit of an example of what an Oregon I-Sector project looks like, following up on Bill's intro. When we were headed into 2020, Oregon had a deficit of 5,800 emergency shelter beds. Existing shelters were no longer able to, they were no longer safe for congregate shelter. And then in 2020, we also had fires throughout the state of Oregon, which actually destroyed 4,000 homes in several different regions of the state across 8 counties. And that 1-2 punch nearly doubled Oregon's already severe deficit of emergency beds. And in response to that, the Association of Oregon Counties and the League of Oregon Cities joined with the Oregon Community Foundation to respond to this crisis. And they joined also with Hacienda CDC, which is a statewide Hispanic organization, and and also with the Oregon Restaurant and Lodging Association and the Oregon State Housing Agency. The partners really settled on the purchase of motels as the way to be helpful in terms of this emergency crisis. And they called on the emergency board of the legislature to allocate $75 million for the purchase of those motels to provide emergency shelter, which then could be used as permanent housing once for various needs once the crisis had passed. The partnership also asked the legislature to designate the Oregon Community Foundation as the fiduciary and the grantor for that project, because our housing agency was already overtasked, and they really were quite upfront about the fact that they could not move money through their systems very quickly at all, and just dealing with the bureaucracy that they have to adhere to. So at the end of the day, the turnkey partnership created 19 new shelters. That was 865 units of housing statewide by purchasing motels in 7 months at an average cost of $87,000 per room, which is less than half the cost of a typical affordable housing unit in Oregon. It actually increased the shelter bed capacity in Oregon by 20%. And in the short session of the legislative session that's now just starting, there's also another proposal to further expand that capacity through another investment in the turnkey partnership. So I think it's, Chris, back to you for now.
Okay, well, just to kind of reiterate that, you know, this project demonstrates the kinds of things that having capacity can do for leaders. And in this case, it was driven by the leaders of the county and city organizations and the Oregon Community Foundation, working with civic organizations like Hacienda CDC. And you know what those leaders needed, because they are all busy people, they needed assistance in getting people aligned and in putting together the partnership and providing the management for the process to essentially arrive at the outcomes that they arrived at, and providing guidance on the way that they operated. Because after all, when you're working in this kind of manner, you want to ensure that the democratic principles are being followed. There's been a good deal of criticism of some kinds of public-private partnerships in this country for not looking at the broader public interest in terms of how they've been conducted or their outcomes. So we've been looking around for examples of how to create this kind of infrastructure, how to find the resources and capacity to support cross-sector partnerships. We haven't found very many examples, but we found a couple in California that are relatively recent that we wanted to talk with you about. Governor Newsom, 2 years ago, over 2 years ago now, appointed a senior advisor for social innovation who came from Stanford, and Stanford has, as you may know, a Center for Social Innovation. And in the 2 years that Kathleen Kelly-Janis, excuse me, has served as senior advisor, she is in his office. She sits in on cabinet meetings, and she has, working with others in that 2 years, developed 44 cross-sector partnerships that have delivered $4 billion in private and philanthropic support, in addition to the state money that went into these areas. COVID relief, housing and homelessness, immigration and refugee issues, jobs in the economy, and early childhood learning and care. The other example we have for you comes from Los Angeles County, where there is a Center for Strategic Partnerships located in the county executive's office. Note that these functions are within the highest level of that particular government. you may be, you all are in New York City, or many of you are, which is a large area. Los Angeles County has 13 million residents. So there, 5 years ago, the philanthropic community working with county commission established this center to work on issues related to children and families. And so in the 5 years they've been in existence, they have developed over 40 private sector partnerships, working with 11 public sector agencies, and invested more than $23.5 million in areas of child protection, healthcare integration, homelessness, juvenile justice reform, and immigration issues. We paid careful attention to what they were doing. They are very small offices located, as I said, working with the key leaders. They spent a lot of time fostering a culture of collaboration. And to do that, they hold listening sessions. They do regular briefings for foundation leaders and other groups. They convene meetings around specific issues to see where interests align. They provide consulting and technical assistance in support of partnerships. And essentially, besides being strategically located and connected to top leadership, it's a small, agile staff, very skilled at relationship building and communication, and supported by their philanthropic community. We've noticed that other leaders have established these kinds of programs. And when those public leaders have left office, the program may continue, but without strong leadership, they slowly atrophy and die. So we think that leadership is key, as we both said. But in addition, we think that for cross-sector partnerships to flourish, there may need to be incentives and policies that support them. And so the private sector may need incentives. For instance, at the international level, we've seen the creation of partnership development funds by some of the international aid organizations. And that encourages the private sector to make investments when they can see that they're going to get some return for. Also, the civic sector may need grant requirements. Foundations that essentially say that applicants must be representative of the private, civic, and civic sectors. And the World Bank, I think, changed from, and Bill, I think you mentioned this in your book, initially required applicants to be governments, and switched that to applicants must be come from cross-sector partners. And government agencies may need enabling legislation to participate. We've done some literature reviews and found that many states have authorizing legislation for public-private partnerships in the transportation or infrastructure area. But one of the things that we're examining is whether this could be useful in the area of cross-sector partnerships. There's some suggestion that legislation can be, as I said, they can establish that agencies, are authorized to do this. But on the other hand, sometimes for instance, in the area of regulatory negotiation at the federal level, that was introduced as a way to get different participants, key stakeholders together, it became a roadblock to essentially gaining greater involvement. But it's certainly an area that we want to examine. Greg, looking to the future, what do you see?
Yeah, well, I'll just try to summarize what we've presented today. We believe that we need innovation in governance to meet the challenges in the social, environmental, and economic issues that we're being presented with in today's world. And unleashing the power of the three sectors working together at a scale that can move the needle will require establishing a dedicated infrastructure and a capacity for that purpose. And it's going to take champions from the private and civic sectors, as well as from government, to accomplish this. And we hope to create a new sector that is independent of the public, private, and civic sectors, but serves to bring them together in joint action, develop new and innovative solutions to those issues that we face. To sustain this new sector, we believe it's essential that it be co-owned and operated by leaders from across the sectors. We also believe that we need to develop new kinds of incentives, as Chris mentioned, for government, business, and philanthropy. They'll provide the capacity for this new leadership partnership sector. And we hope to bring the supports in Oregon that we've identified to scale and create those incentives to enable leaders to create multi-sector partnerships in Oregon that will meet the challenges of governance going forward into the 21st century. Thanks a lot for inviting us today.
Well, I patiently had my hand up for a while. So,
Oh, sorry.
no, this is, you guys already know I have great admiration for everything you're doing. I have three. Let's start with housing, since you've already succeeded with housing. And I would argue there are a lot of social issues that are important, and a lot of them are challenging, but housing maybe in some ways is and maybe the most challenging. And so I'd like to address three issues. One you already addressed. The problem with a product of providing affordable housing is it takes, even if you're committed to it, it takes a long time. So how do you address the speed issue? And you guys addressed it. You bought stuff that was already built. So that's a lesson, it seems to me. And so there's hope, right? But the two issues that you didn't address, at least on our call so far, maybe you can. One is we have a new governor and a new mayor, both of whom have talked about housing and homelessness and addressing it and have all sorts of proposals. And already the bubbling is starting to what problems they're going to have. One is NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. So everybody supports affordable housing as long as it's not in my neighborhood. So you overcame that. Motels are not necessarily upper income housing, but at least their market and the people living there move. You made them more permanent, and that's a problem. And the second one is someone who's been involved in the homeless issue for 40 years. Part of the problem in providing homeless housing and then converting it into long-term housing is that the people in the emergency situation don't want to go and have nowhere to go. And there's still not enough homeless housing. So question number one is, what did you do and what are your recommendations about overcoming NIMBY? And the second is, how do you address the issue of trying to make, for example, the housing that you guys have created as shelter, how do you convert that then into permanent housing?
I'll take a stab at that. I think on the NIMBY issue with this particular project, we had one of the conditions for a grant that the community would like to have the facility, that they actually thought that not just those that in the government, but the community itself was supportive the proposal. And so we did have, I would say, 3 or 4 sites around the state where that standard was not met. There was significant community opposition in about 3 or 4 locations, but in the vast majority of those, we didn't have that problem. But where we did, we simply did not make a grant to that particular jurisdiction. And I would say, though, that overall the NIMBY problem with this particular project seemed to be less than what I've experienced in other low-income housing proposals. And I don't know exactly why that is, but I think that the motels located in locations that aren't as to some neighborhoods, as you say, they've already been used for transient stays, and so I think there was more acceptance generally of them in that way. And in addition to that, the legislature was ready to adopt some legislation that would actually make them not subject to a land use action, these conversions. Mm-hmm. And so that was another element that I think will be helpful in the future. They didn't actually have that in place when we did this particular project, but I think they will do that coming up. And so that is the NIMBY situation that we faced. The other thing that you mentioned was the acceptability of the motels to the homeless population. And we actually had some research that indicated that presented different options, housing options to homeless individuals. And of all the options, the motels scored the highest in terms of acceptability to the homeless population. So that was another I think factor that has contributed to the success of these so far. Did I answer all your questions?
Yes, Bill? Thank you. I see we have another hand, Jenna.
Hi, good afternoon, Chris and Greg. Thanks so much for a great presentation. I was curious to talk a little bit more about funding as like a force function for this to happen. I work in emergency preparedness and healthcare, and the federal grants force coalition building and force you to have certain sectors working together. And it sort of started as checking boxes, but over time, it's really worked. And I'm just curious to hear a little bit more from you all about what you see as the role of private funders, public funders doing that, as well as sometimes when the money goes away, that organizational function also goes away. So how do you have sustainability of that coordination function to outlive the money? Curious to hear your thoughts.
I think that's really a good observation. And I would say that one of the things that I have observed, I worked for a foundation for a while, and I certainly have stayed in touch with what the thinking within foundations. I think foundations are, in my experience, increasingly putting emphasis on organizations working in partnership with other organizations, and that they can be a powerful force for keeping something like a joint partnership going. If they that's part of the incentive that they have the potential to create. So at least that's my initial reaction, that the philanthropic center can have a strong role there.
And I would add that that in this turnkey project, one of the sustainability strategies that we've adopted is really having local partnerships around each motel. And we haven't done this in all of them, but where we have done it, it has been very successful, I think, in building ownership among the 3 sectors, public, private, and civic, in their success. And so we're going to keep monitoring that, but we believe that that's a pretty essential element of sustaining these facilities over time. And I think as far as the foundations are concerned, I think as Chris says, we hope that they're moving in the direction of thinking about this more deeply. And what we've seen over time is sort of an evolution in how they think about getting different sectors involved in different various projects. You know, at one point they would just simply say, who are your partners? And people would have a big list of their partners and submit their grant. And I think that what we're starting to see is a more deep thinking about that. And in our view, they really need to be more deliberate about how they make grants to multi-sector groups and really make sure that they are making a grant to a group that has truly developed a partnership among themselves rather than just simply this kind of list description of who the people are that they work with.
Thank you.
Greg, do
Jeremy?
you want to say anything more about the Housing Innovation Partnership that's just beginning?
Yeah, we're putting together a housing innovation partnership that that will look at different strategies for homelessness. Also look at the advent of modular housing, which has become much more viable now, and trying to help it get to scale. And then looking at there's some 3D printing of houses going on in Oregon now that we're looking at as a possible addition to the innovation list. And there's also a move by the Port of Portland to actually create a modular housing manufacturing site out at the port around mass timber in Oregon. You know, the cross-laminated timber and mass timber is just an emerging kind of construction technique that that we believe has great hope for a lot of the forest health issues we have in the state, and at the same time creates a strong building product that we're looking to provide some support for that innovation going forward. And then the home builders have workforce housing proposals that are going to require some legislative changes. And one example is that they have a 24-unit housing product, they call it, that actually it comes under our condominium laws. And because it has a 10-year period of repose. In other words, people can sue for any kind of defects in building materials over a 10-year period, which has made financing virtually impossible for that product. So we're talking about innovating in how they do the construction up front in a more an enhanced way that might allow for that period of repose to be reduced to 5 years. Things like that. We're just trying to look across the housing spectrum to see how we can get more units through some of these more innovative housing approaches.
I have a question about, I know you raised some criticisms about those kinds of partnerships, and that some have said that they're not democratic or that they kind of lack some transparency. And I guess just to play devil's advocate here, could you talk a little bit about how you've responded to those claims and how realistic they are, and how you're mitigating those risks?
Yeah, we actually haven't encountered that here. You know, just in doing the literature reviews, I have observed that there are places where there's been great criticism about the nature of the public-private partnership. You know, assertions that it was entered into to the advantage of the private sector and to the disadvantage of the public sector. And I think that that's where having some, you know, principles and standards that these are conducted by, and having transparency and accountability is so critical, because when they come in for criticism, and sometimes that criticism is very justly leveled at them, they have no way to defend themselves because they can't essentially show how they have attempted to be transparent and accountable and how their objectives are in the broader public interest.
I think that's where too, having the philanthropic community involved to some degree, particularly as an early starter, they not only put high risk capital at risk, which is great. Many times they don't expect to get their money back, but they also put their reputation on the line. So if there's a significant foundation as a partner, they're very sensitive to criticism of lack of transparency and collusion and everything else. So one of the advantages, there are many challenges by partnerships, but one advantage is a good partnership means everybody has access to the books. So, you know, you have that foundation partner there who put up money, they gave their money away, they put their reputation on the line. They're going to be, as I think, as effective police of corruption as anybody. You can pass all sorts of laws, but you know, when they're sitting at the table and they have a right to see the books, I think that can help a lot. So just one person's opinion. We have time for one more question or comment, or if you guys want to make a final statement. We're getting pretty close to the witching hour. Tick, tick, tick. Anybody want to take a last flyer? All right. There's nothing wrong with taking a few minutes. Greg, you look like you had something to say. Why don't you wrap us up for today?
Okay. Well, we're just delighted to be here. We really believe that this is an emerging field in the country, and we really look forward to working with you guys as you in comparing notes as we go forward. So I hope that there's some way that we can put together a network of people that are trying to move these kinds of partnerships forward, and we can continue to learn from each other about what works and what doesn't work, because I think it's just a tremendous opportunity for an innovation in governance. We agree, and as the three of us have talked offline, and anybody wants to help, it'd be great. I'd like to get some foundation funding and do one of our video case studies about your housing initiative, because I think that's really something that people could not only learn from, but it could be replicated in lots of places. So, and particularly given the pandemic and how many hotels and motels are either on the verge of bankruptcy or already bankrupt, this could be a great source of immediately available housing. So let's keep in touch on that. Anybody have a great idea for a foundation to give us some money? That'd be great. We don't need a lot, you know, maybe $25,000 to do it. Anyway, thank you so much, Jeremy. I'll flip it back to you to close this out.
Thank you. Chris, did you have anything else to say?
No, I just wanted to say thank you for giving us this opportunity. Really have appreciated the chance to make this connection.
Thank you.
Thank you both. So thank you also to our guests who joined us today. And you can find, as I said earlier, our past recording sessions on the EMPA Food for Thought page. And you can also register for future sessions. So we hope to see you soon.